We are live. Welcome to the Unbelief Podcast. I'm Jeremy. And today we are talking about a question. I've got a bunch of questions on social media. And this question is from a user on TikTok, Chico Hernandez. It says, how can I reconcile the idea of languages originating at the Tower of Babel and the knowledge about languages that shows it wasn't like that? So, something that you may or may not know about Gabby is that she is in the field of linguistics and working on.
Yes, I am a social linguist. So I specifically study language variation. I look at attitudes towards language variation and what those implications are in society. But I do a plethora of things.
Right, and so we're gonna start just by saying I think the user is correct. Like the Tower of Babel story does not reflect the science of linguistics, but I thought it'd be interesting to talk to a linguist to get a sense of what it actually, like what science actually says about the where languages came from and how they evolved and all of that. And so I think maybe we just step all the way back in time to like there being no language, right? And and so, very at the very beginning, how does language emerge in humans?
Yeah, so I just want to preface that I'm not a historical linguist, but I will
Right.
use the best of my knowledge to kind of have this
Yeah, for sure.
conversation. So, that's a very good question about the origins. I mean, let's just say the first humans were to appear, and we know that there are differences between human language and animal language. Like animals have language just like we do. And so I'm going to assume, I don't know too much, that there probably was some sort of either noise that didn't form words or some sort of body language that was
Right.
trying to communicate, which then forms into sounds, which sounds then evolve into words that then evolve into some sort of language.
Right.
And I'm going to just assume from what I know about Pidgin and Creole languages, because
Uh-huh.
this is important to talk about in this conversation. Pidgin languages are usually they occur when you have another person who doesn't have a common language, and
Uh-huh.
you use words to try and communicate. And so usually this Pidgin language is going to be very limited in its grammar.
Right.
And so
this is okay. So a pidgin language. Just to step back, humans, the the species before Homo sapiens, like probably didn't have all the ability to like make the sounds and do all of that. Then Homo sapiens comes out, has that ability, starts making the sounds, all of the things that you just said, and that's where sort of language starts to begin. But yeah, but so a pidgin language, because I don't know any of this, so I'm just going to be the ignorant person, making sure that I understand, standing in for the other people. So what you're saying is that pidgin language is something that happens when, like, if I was an English speaker and you were a Spanish speaker and neither of us knew each other's language, we would, if we tried to communicate, we would start making up things, words or sounds or whatever. Is that what you're saying?
yes, and I guess I should have actually taken a step back because this happens when we have language contact
Okay.
with other humans.
Okay.
But if we're going back to when I guess we were Neanderthals, which I
Right.
believe we were still animalistic to
Right.
some degree. I actually quite not sure if Neanderthals had language.
Right.
I just know that animals and humans, like our languages, are distinct in a lot of ways. And
Uh-huh.
one of the things that we talk about is like creativity and the infinite amount of like sentences we can create, and the fact that we can use irony. And there's like a lot of things that distinguish a human language from an animal language. So
Okay.
I'm sure in which animals, they can create, like they can have sound and they talk to each other. But one thing they can't talk about is, past tense or future tense. No one
Right.
can.
Right.
And so I'm assuming when humans they got to the point where they were able to create words, and
Yeah.
of course the first language is still unknown. We're quite
Right.
sure. Language emerged, and so with the one group of people, I'm sure they had their own language. When there was language contact,
Yeah.
when we start seeing language evolution, right?
Right, because part of the Tower of Babel story is that obviously they were speaking to each other, and then there's this whole part of the story that maybe we'll get into, maybe we won't, about building a tower. God comes down, and as a punishment, or in some ways as a preventative, God God creates all of these languages, and everybody disperses. And so I think what I hear you saying is like that, like initial language creation event, that doesn't happen.
Well, if you think about it from a scientific point of view and a linguistic point of view, linguists would probably say no, just because we have so much evidence of seeing language evolve.
Right.
We see with language contact, we have these pidgin languages that arise, and then
so give us a little bit more about the pidgin language, like what that is. So like we have two different languages. We start, I say Jeremy.
Yeah. And I would say Gabby, and maybe we'd understand that's our name. And if you're speaking English and I'm speaking Spanish, well, I would know that there are certain cognates that potentially we could maybe connect on. Or
what's a cognate?
A cognate is just it's basically a word in another. It's a word in another language that is similar to the other language as well.
Right.
So an example of this would be parquear, which means to park your car. To tweet something. So
So like they sound the same.
Computer, you can tell we're talking about the same thing here. And so
Right.
We would probably try to find cognates. If not, we would probably create words where me and you would understand what we're trying to say. Whether they're verbs, nouns, or whatever they are.
Right.
And so a pidgin language tends to be a simplified language that basically, like for communication between groups that don't have a shared language. That's what pidgin is.
Yeah.
And so usually they are, again, limited in grammar. And so when a society or a culture decides to then teach a pidgin language to their child, like that's the language they acquire from birth, then they become a Creole language, because now they become Creole languages because now we're going to get into a bit of like
Creole, like the food.
No, so Creole, that's what they're called. They're called Creole languages. And so linguists always say there's never a native speaker of a pidgin language, because it's something that is created with somebody who doesn't have a shared language. But a Creole, there are native speakers of Creole, because as a kid I could acquire a Creole language
from somebody who had the pidgin language. Gotcha.
And the reason why we say this is because if you get a little bit of theory about linguistics, Noam Chomsky, he's very famous. He created generative linguistics. And one of the things that he argues is for universal grammar.
Right.
We have in our minds an innate ability to form sentences, to form grammar without ever having, it's called the poverty of stimulus, without ever having been exposed to certain sentences.
Right.
Like kids will know, for example, they'll say, I goed. And they already have the rule knowing that past tense is ed, even though it's technically I went.
Right.
They have these rules in their head, even if they've never heard it, that they can form. Okay, I know that past tense is formed this way.
Right. And so like I was a super nerd around Noam Chomsky when I was in undergrad. And so if I'm correct, he says that there's like this part of the brain, this hardwired with these syntactical structures, and that's just, you're born with that. And I think if I remember, there was this sort of observational element that that people who have kids might see, that there's like this moment of like there's words, and then all of a sudden there's sentences, and that points to the like unlocking of the syntactical structures. But like we've created a mental lexicon, like a mental dictionary of like words that our parents are saying to us, and then when that part of the brain is unlocked, the words are sort of mapped onto those syntaxes. Is that right?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, universal grammar is exactly what you're saying about there being an innate like understanding of how to even form the sentences, to put the words together. I will say that sometimes people are like debated, and they say, well, it's not only what's in your head, is actually what matters is the environment that you're
Okay.
in, you know.
Okay.
And so there is conversation about one of the things that proves, I guess, Noam Chomsky's theory is that, well, one, the poverty of the stimulus, as well as the second thing being, for example, the critical period, which is this, if anyone knows what this is, but they say that between ages of 1 to 12, there is a period where you can acquire language and still sound like a native speaker, still have your like phonetics still sound like I put native speaker in quotes because
Right.
it's a native speaker. This
Right.
is so debated, but to sound still, I guess, as similar as a monolingual of that language, I should say.
Right.
As an L1 user, which is the L1 means first language in the field of linguistics.
Okay.
And so when people say that, but then other people argue like, well, there are people who are well in their 18, 19, 20 adults who, you know, it is harder for an adult to acquire a language, but there are adults who do it and they sound like a monolingual about
Right,
language,
right.
So people will debate like, oh, well, the critical period proves Noam Chomsky's point that, you know, the whole, sorry to sidetrack this.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
I don't know if you know the story of Katie Genovese.
No.
I'm sorry, her name's not Katie Genovese, I'm so sorry. Oh, what's her name? She's the famous. I'm getting confused. So sorry. At this side tangent, there's psychology about the bystander effect with this woman who, I don't know if you learned about this, but apparently she like got like terrible things happened to her, and everyone thought they were going to call the police, and no one did, and like that was a terrible story. But I also learned at the same time that this girl who she was apparently left, and I forgot. I think her name is Katie. I'm not sure.
Right.
She got left. Like her parents were really abusive towards her. They left her locked up in her room. Linguists didn't find her until she was like after 12 years old, and they tried to teach her language, and they realized that she couldn't.
Oh, interesting.
She could acquire some certain things, but she wasn't able to speak well. Like she wasn't a lot of speech therapy, but basically this case showed that there is a critical time period where you can acquire language to have your phonetics sound well and be able to form sentences that are grammatical.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that talks about like the universal grammar theory of Noam Chomsky.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you're fine. No, it's great.
I brought this up because the reason why I say when you teach a pidgin language to kids, it becomes Creole, because the reason why it's a Creole language now is because kids have this innate grammar in their head. Then the Creole language isn't so simplified with grammar.
I see.
It's more complex because kids know, or children know, that, you know, there's an innate thing going on in their head, how to form sentences, and that theirs becomes a bit more structural in its language.
Right. And so I guess what you're saying is like what happens is the brain evolves the language by placing it through this, you know, language acquisition process that happens with children, because their brain is needing all of the things, and so they end up just sort of being created or emerging.
That's actually a great way to put it. And with this conversation, then, if we know that with language contact we're getting these pigeons all over the world that are then becoming Creoles and continuing to evolve, it's going to be possible for languages to just be, you know, like there's to just appear, like one moment where now we get what all and not even just like the hundreds of languages that are official, but the indigenous languages, the dialects, and all the ones that exist, you know. So the Tower of Babel probably doesn't explain, you know. So I don't know if the Tower of Babel only talks about, well, God scattered the languages, and then does languages that evolve count as well, or do they not?
Well, I mean, it's a very short story, right? And so, you know, the story is that like God gives them all different languages to confuse them, and basically that the people that speak the same language are dispersed, and they go to all these different regions. And, you know, when you think about, you know, ancient people who don't have Noam Chomsky, one of the things, the questions that they are answering is like, well, I've met people from this other place. They have this other language. Where did that come from? Right. And so that question is answered by a bunch of different cultures. But this one in the ancient Near East develops this legend, this myth of how languages were created.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I'm sure people in their own groups before they, of course, came in contact had their own sort of system of language that they came up with, of course,
Uh-huh.
which, of course, then linguists start putting labels on it. Things become Spanish and French and Arabic and
Yeah.
Hindi. But then when you get this language contact, right, they already had you meet these people. I guess God in his wanting to confuse them when they meet someone, maybe they don't know how to communicate, so they develop this pigeon language.
Right.
Either way, they still find a way.
And so, yeah, so what I'm hearing you say, if I try to put it all together and tell me if I'm wrong, those initial humans, the Homo sapiens, right, that are kind of all over the world, um, begin trying to communicate with each other in the absence of language. And when they do that, they are creating, even though it's not two different languages coming together. The process is that they create an imperfect and incomplete language that you call a pigeon language, basically.
When they come in contact with each other.
Right. So, these two random Homo sapiens that are living close to each other start trying to communicate, and they end up creating a pigeon language, this sort of like basic thing. But then when they have children and it's passed on to them, the children will end up creating a more fully formed language. And that's happening all over the world.
Yeah.
And so that means that like very different languages are being created because it sounds like it's based on the uniqueness of these two people or this group of people. And so there's no real way to predict what they're going to do. And migration over vast differences doesn't take place quickly. But as it does, this process keeps happening. And then and so then I think right now, and I'm assuming in the past, we have like English and Spanish and French and Arabic and Mandarin and all of these different languages that, at least for someone who is an individual who is living and not thinking critically about language, it feels like English is English, right? And like it's always been English and it will always be English. So, obviously there's this evolution of languages, but now we've got languages that feel like they've been around forever.
They feel that way,
Uh-huh.
but if you really, it's actually, I love language so much because it's really curious to go back. And even though we have modern English today, we've had old English years ago.
Mhm.
That sounds very different from what we have today. The same when you study Shakespeare in school, like you can see kind of the different like forms that they use, like the different pronouns they use, the different everything, right? And like now we see,
Right.
things have become simplified as we go through history. And one thing that speakers love to do, or users of language, is simplify language. When we find things, and you'll see this if you study the history of language, but if you see like grammatical forms that are kind of hard, like not hard, but for example, we don't really say with whom, right? With that,
Right.
that M at the end is kind of uncomfortable for our point of articulation with us putting our mouth together.
Yeah.
So just say with who. It's just easier for us as speakers to say that. So,
and then if you've got a grammar Nazi in the room, they interject immediately and they say whom.
Yeah, but you don't even say that in your everyday speech. Right? I guess someone wants to be prescriptivist, sure, but all I have to say is that if you go back, you kind of will see that English looked really different than it does today.
Now, as soon as you said that, I remembered something from high school. Is this an actual thing? Is there something called Middle English?
Yes, there is Middle English.
And what is Middle English?
Yeah, I don't know too much about English because I didn't say this, but I studied this Romance language. I'm under the Spanish program. So all I know is that I don't quite actually.
Well, let's tell us. Is there something like that in Spanish?
Yes, and so because I did take a class on the history of Spanish,
Okay.
and so we kind of looked at medieval times and the
Okay.
way that verbs looked.
Uh-huh.
And so if everyone knows anything about Spanish, you have a typical verb like haber, which means like to be. Or sorry, not to be. I'm sorry. It means like there is or there was.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. But we see like in Old Spanish, we see like a difference with the way verbs. I wish I could write this out for people so they can see it. But we see that the infinitive actually didn't end in an R; it ended in an E. So a lot of the verbs would be abre, A-B-R-E. And so we do see a kind of a switch with the way infinitives are formed. In the same way in English, we see a shift probably with words and their meaning, for example. We see that a lot of times words meant different things than what they mean today.
Yeah.
Like one of the famous examples that we always study in English is the term gay, which used to mean very happy and joyful.
Right.
Which now has become, a term to represent people who are homosexual, right?
Yeah.
And so we do see words developing, having like different meanings, and also the forms themselves changing. Like one thing in Spanish, for example, is we used to have like a really complex form of the subjunctive. And the subjunctive is a mood that we use to describe desires and doubts and fears and things that are emotive clauses and stuff like that. And so we see like a very complex form of like future subjunctive, which is no longer used anymore because it just was really complex. We didn't need it, so we kind of got rid of it.
Right.
So we're seeing, and not just future subjunctive, but we actually are seeing today in the research of Spanish that subjunctive is kind of starting to not be preferred by a speaker. And so there's a lot of research done in like not only Spanish in the US, but around the Spanish speaking world, where we have the other form would be the indicative, which is a different type of mood. But people would prefer to use the indicative over the subjunctive.
Okay.
And so we're seeing that language is still evolving today with like forms changing, like syntactic forms kind of not being preferred, or one being preferred over the other and one being let go. And so with English, I'm sure the same things have happened where different words, whether they were formed morphologically, so morphemes, morphology being about a word, the way that words are formed, and syntactic the way words are ordered to create sentences.
Right.
We'll see that there has been maybe a preference for how we form sentences, words changing, like their structure, and then we could see a lot of these processes, I feel like, a bit more evident when we talk about phonology and phonetics. So, trying to think of an example, like for example, we wrote bottle as Bottle, but we know that there's like lotto stop bottle, right? Or just a bottle. It's just easier for us to say.
Yeah. So nobody says bottle. That sounds really weird.
It sounds weird, or if someone would say that to me, would indicate that they're not a native speaker of English.
Yeah, right? And the way I've not ever thought of this. The way we say bottle is, it actually sounds like a D, bottle.
And that's that tap R we call that. That's the phonetic R. And so that would just be bottle. It's literally a tap of the tongue. That's why we say it like that. And so there's a bunch of other things like that. Like water is another one. Instead of water, we don't have that like strong T, but it's like a tap. And so we do things as speakers to simplify it and make it easier for us to pronounce words.
Right.
Can you imagine going all the way back how much stuff has changed? Being that there's so much changes now.
Yeah. No, that makes a ton of sense. And then I imagine there's also a cultural and power element to language, and what is that?
One of my favorite things that I studied in my social linguistics class is the first question that they always ask: what is the difference between a dialect and a language? Do you have it?
I have no idea.
Yeah, so literally, from a linguistic perspective, there is no difference. The difference is political.
Okay.
And they always say a dialect is a language that an army and a navy, because it's all about power. And so when your question was about power.
Yeah, power and all of that with which languages do whatever.
100%. It's all politics at the end of the day. If we look, for example, I'm going to go back to Spanish. Because
no, of course.
We have standardized language. And so we have decided, and from an academic point of view, that this form of Spanish is the way that we're going to teach it. And this is going to be the standard. and whoever does not speak the standard in maybe a professional setting, and like as an interview or as a job, is going to be penalized in some way.
Right.
Right. And so an example of this is if anyone's taking Spanish who's listening, a lot of times you will learn when we're learning those pronouns, I, you, he, she, it,
right,
they, them. We have the vosotros form, which tends to be a different way to say you all, but it's the form that's only used in Spain.
Right.
However, in every single Spanish class, it is taught with this.
Right. No, I was taught vosotros and nosotros.
Right. And so we have nosotros, which is used in all Latin America. Vosotros is only used in Spain, which is very curious. However, there's another form that people don't know about called voceo.
Okay.
And voceo is very similar to tú. It's like a way to be informal in some countries and a way to be formal. And voceo is used in 50% of Latin America.
You are kidding me.
Yes.
Voceos.
Voceo. So it'd be something like, sorry, I don't use voceo on my dialect.
Yeah.
They go away. You would say something like, tú callas, for example, like you be quiet. So it has a grammatical form to it, the way that you conjugate the verb. But this form is used in like a lot of Central America, and a lot of like in Chile and El Salvador, in Nicaragua and Argentina. It's used everywhere. Yet we're not taught this in school. So
that's interesting.
Learning Spanish goes to
right.
Latin America is like, I've never heard of this form, and like only know about vosotros, which I find quite curious, being that only one country uses vosotros, which is Spain.
Yeah.
We have over 50% of Latin America using voceo. So you do have language standardization of what is, I guess, what's controlled and what's being taught.
Yeah, I remember. So I had a professor change in college when I was from one Spanish course to another, and the first professor taught us to say vosotros, and then the next one told us to say vosotros. And every time they spoke, they changed from a traditional like English V sound to an English B sound. And if you went with the first professor and then you had the second professor, you walk into the room and you can't understand. Right, because it's one letter, the pronunciation of that one letter. But
so very interesting, actually, that she taught you to say it that way. Well, technically, in standard Spanish, this V that we have in English doesn't exist in Spanish.
Okay.
We have a B sound, the proverbial B. And so a lot of times when you have a word written in Spanish with it orthographically with that letter V, would pronounce it vosotros with the bilabial. However, there is research that shows that there are parts of Latin America that does actually pronounce that actually does have that V.
Yeah.
It's called a labial dental fricative. Your teeth are on top of your tongue. Labial for labial for your lips, and then what did I say? Labial dental.
Yeah.
But yeah, your teeth are touching your lips. Labial dental fricative. And so there are parts of Latin America that are showing that this V exists. However, in standard Spanish, it's technically a V.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because one of my friends is a native Spanish speaker from they are from they grew up in the United States in South Texas, but their family was just across the border, and all of their family uses the V sound. Yeah.
Yeah, the V?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, I will say it's much more common in Spanish in the U.S. and for a lot of reasons.
Right.
One, probably language contact, because English has this V.
And it's written with the V.
It is written with the V. And people who learn, like students who learn Spanish in the U.S., probably more inclined to use that V because that's already repertoire linguistically. And so if bilinguals, they have both sounds. So sometimes like I find myself using both,
Yeah. And so for some reason I had associated that maybe with the power, but back to the sort of like political endorsement. Yeah.
Yeah. So back with that, it's just that, if there are so many things that can happen. So let's just say someone decides to deviate from the standard, and something so subtle as using a V when they're speaking. Someone could decide and like just penalize them and kind of just be like, okay, well, this person's not a native speaker, so therefore I'm going to have my judgments and decide, like, either be mean or not offer a job or do whatever.
Right.
And so there's a lot of, and this happens with English too.
Right.
Like, we have, Black English or African American vernacular. For example, copula B, we call it, or habitual B, which we add in front of like, I be going to the store, right?
Okay.
That's something very typical of African American English. And so we find that African American vernacular has its own set of rules. A lot of grammar stuff that's going on, but however, if you're kind of penalized to be using that sort of dialect or vernacular in a job setting or in a professional setting, right?
Right. Because the dominant culture has established that the correct way of saying it is I am going to the store. And so since it's not endorsed by, like what you said, an army or a
dialect is an army without sorry, a dialect is a language without an army or a navy.
Right. Yeah. And so since that does not have an army or a navy, it's not like endorsed by an official power, then it is treated as, it's minimized, it's treated as not correct.
Yes.
And then that's associated with less educated.
Exactly. And so there is unfortunately this, I feel like maybe general, or I should say language ideologies about people who have accents are not educated. Accent has nothing to do with education.
Right.
Or things of like, well, someone didn't use the standard form, therefore they're uneducated. When actually, no, we're talking about here code switching now, right?
Right.
You can have different ways of speaking and that being completely fine. But it is all about like power, and unfortunately, language is another way that we've used to oppress people who don't fit in the standard,
right,
aren't part of the majority. And so I'm very interested in like what happens with this sort of, when someone doesn't follow the standard. And there's a lot of research that shows, for example, people who deviate from the standard are either not offered a job or they're like there are languages that are racialized, So I'm sure it's not only that someone used the habitual B, but it's because the person who used it is black,
Right.
And so there's already like stigmatization going on with language and race being connected.
Yeah, for sure.
So there's just like a lot to do with like power from an institutional level. Like, well, if we're gonna say that only these forms are allowed, you already marginalizing people who don't have maybe access to what a standard is, their dialect, what they learn in their community, and then when they want to use it, then they're getting discriminated against either in a job, not being offered a job. Maybe there's some sort of like, I'm not going to give her promotion because I think she's undereducated by the way that she speaks.
Yeah.
So many things.
Yeah. Oh, that's so fascinating. So the question started with the Tower of Babel. So maybe I've been asking you a bunch of questions. You grew up in the evangelical world. You grew up being taught that the Tower of Babel is how languages were created. So ask me some questions about the Tower of Babel.
I absolutely will. I do want to come back to
the
point. You asked me about Middle English. Just the Middle English that exists, and I wanted to say that it was roughly spoken between 1066 to 1500s.
Right. And I remember where I encountered it was in English class. The Canterbury Tales by Chaucer was written in Middle English, and so the teacher had us try to read it and read it to us, and it made absolutely no sense. Yeah. And that is so crazy. Okay.
Yes. So actually, I do have a question for you.
Okay.
So you said that you were a language nerd.
Yep.
And so when did you consider one evolution to be true? And if that was when you were a kid, then what did you make of like the language story?
Right. So it was gradual. When I grew up, I had limited access to knowledge because the internet hadn't been created. And so I was taught by people that I was told to respect and were really smart that evolution was a lie and all of that. I am, as I say all the time, I'm a deep skeptic. So it means I try to base my beliefs off of reliable data. But when the reliable data is not reliable, you believe the wrong thing. But also it means that I and my beliefs are rather malleable when there is more reliable data available to me. So as I grew up, it started in high school and then really came into its own in college, where I began to say, like, no, that's wrong. Creation science is wrong. Evolution is real, and that. So when I was a kid, I just believed that language just happened. Um, I didn't think as critically about, like, oh, well, they were having to speak language at the time, but I just sort of assumed there was this like one language and then God created all the other ones. Um, and then as I began to, in colleges, when I studied communication, it was my communication theory class that talked about generative grammar. And that's what I chose to do my final research paper on, and just sort of dove deep into that world, and learned a little bit about how languages form, and all of that. So yeah, like when I was before I it was part of it is what's underlying, I think, a lot of the problems that exist outside of like the biblical text being read literally, is there is a distrust baked into this perspective of science, right? That somehow a literal reading of the Bible trumps science, and science can't contradict it. If there is an apparent contradiction between the two, the Bible always wins the tie. And so, but that thing actually is a sort of insidious foundational value, because what it does is it allows a deeper distrust of science that goes into things like vaccines and all of that stuff. Because once science is treated as sort of less, and not respected, then all kinds of things can emerge from that underlying value.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, so to go back to when you took your communicator class and started learning about, you said a little bit about evolution of language.
No, no, no. It was mostly about how communication happens, the different ways that mediated communication affects knowledge and understanding. The linguistics part was very, very small. Yeah.
Oh, but is that when you first started being like, maybe the Tower of Babel isn't accurate? Or when did you
Yeah,
first start?
I would say it's all part of the same moment. That late high school, early college, when I started to be exposed to more information and started to think more critically about the biblical text. And so it was right around there where the Tower of Babel would have fallen for me.
So you were doing it simultaneously. It wasn't like you were learning about, okay, oh, I learned about language evolves, and then you had this separate belief, like, oh, but also the Tower of Babel is going in your head.
Right. Yeah. No, I think it was all kind of happening at the same time. And there's a moment where you're like, oh, I haven't thought about the Tower of Babel yet. Well, that's ridiculous. Language didn't happen that way. Well, I guess that's not accurate. But then I think there's the what sometimes you just sort of dismiss it and you throw the baby out with the bathwater, that the Tower of Babel isn't true. So I don't need to look at it. But that's actually playing on the literalist's playing field, that if something isn't literally true, then it's not true. Once you begin to have a more nuanced view of things, returning to a story like the Tower of Babel that is not literally true in that way, but then you start asking questions, well, like, what does this mean?
Yeah, I only ask because I think for me, like, I was probably having some severe cognitive dissonance now that I
Yeah.
think about it. Because, I'm doing my PhD now in linguistics, but in undergrad, I was a Romance language major, so I
Hmm.
was still studying language to some capacity. And this is when I was peak evangelical Christian.
Uh-huh.
And so I remember taking a class, because I was a Romance language major, we had to take like a kind of like a history of Romance languages. And so I remember being in that class, and this lesson was about where the Romance languages came from. And
Right.
the professor pointing to the screen and kind of being like, Well, there's a lot of stories about where languages came from. Here are some myths. One of them comes from the Bible and Tower of Babel. The other one comes from this story, like he's going through all the different religions. However, these are all false.
Yeah, right.
And he goes
These are
on
all
to
false.
right to explain kind of how science, like linguistically, where these languages come from.
Uh-huh.
And we're just tuning him out because I'm like, he's wrong. Like he
Right.
doesn't. I'm like, of course, the Tower of Babel happened. And this was a thought where I was still learning about language contact and
Uh-huh.
all these things, and like I just did not connect the two. Like,
Uh-huh.
hey, maybe the story of the Tower of Babel was wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that would have started my deconstruction back then. Like,
Right.
if one thing's wrong, then how can I trust everything else?
Right.
That's kind of what did it for me when I did the patriarchy did it for
Uh-huh.
me. And so I'm just like wondering, yeah, had I gone through like a, I don't know, had I not had such severe cognitive dissonance, because for me, I was also into eschatology at this time. Like,
Oh, right, right.
the end times, right? And
Yes.
so I remember being like, well, if the Tower of Babel happened, I had so many questions about heaven. I was like,
right, no, for
are
sure.
we gonna speak the same language? Like, because I'm like, it's like every nation, tribe, and tongue is going to be up in heaven at the table. So, am I going to be able to speak Arabic? Like,
right.
Or am I going to be able to speak Hindi? Will someone else, or is it like, are we going to learn a common language?
Uh-huh.
And so I was like, oh, I think the way God's going to redeem this story
Okay.
is if we all get like one like lingua franca of heaven, and we just because that's what was originally
sort of the reversal of the Tower of Babel. Yeah, yeah.
There was one language and God confused them and did multiple languages. So maybe we'll go back to one language.
Oh wow.
I don't know. So I was into like, okay, so I'm learning about all this about
which is the thing that like your brain does when you have cognitive dissonance, right? It starts to spin a narrative to fix the dissonance so that you don't, because it just is it's a mentally taxing process. It makes you uncomfortable. Yeah, that's really interesting. So so you've got the Tower of Babel now.
Yeah. So honestly, I guess that's something. I guess when I started deconstructing, I never really looked at the Tower of Babel because it's kind of just like, yeah, now that you say, I'm like, yeah, that's probably not the way it happened.
Yeah.
So when you want to talk about it, I haven't done like a deep dive into that the way
right
into like the Bible and Jesus.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think from what I know linguists about how languages become in contact, how they evolve, and I've been learning a bit more about evolution. I haven't really just researched any of that. Yeah, I don't know if it was one instance.
Right.
However, I can see kind of some truth to it about, language is dispersed over time. If
sure.
You want to give it a little bit of an interpretive feel.
Right. But it's interesting to me, the focus on the language which is the punishment in the story. But that's the punishment in the story. The story is not about, it's not called the Tower of Language. It's called the Tower of Babel. It's about this tower. Yeah. And I think, and this is, so I'll just go into like, there's lots of layers of meaning that could be there. One of them is this idea that like humans have this process of making a tall tower, this new technology, and they are very impressed with that. And impressed with themselves, and say it could reach the heavens. So basically, they're saying like, "Oh, we've become gods, right? We have the power of a god because we've created this technology that does this amazing thing." And then God looks down or comes down to look at it, because there's like a little trash talking there where like, oh, it's so small from God's point of view that God can't see it, so God has to come down to see it. And then God says, "Oh, they will become like God, so let's confuse their language." And this is this punishment to keep at this like base level reading, to keep them from becoming like God. Now, one way to look at this though is to think about it as a story about technology. And saying that like this is this human tendency. We create some technology that is impressive in comparison to what came before, and when we do that, we sort of overstate our amazingness. Right? Oh, like this is crazy. This is who could have imagined? And then we sort of treat ourselves as gods. And the technology as the evidence of that. But when we do that, there's problems, because if you are a god, then what you do is the right thing. especially in this idea that a God is fully good. And so if technology is the evidence of that, then the technology is good. But what happens is when you treat yourself like a god, it is very easy then to dismiss the evil that you do, right? And technology, it just makes us more efficient at what already exists in us. So like, so while, I live in Silicon Valley, there's this like, oh, we're going to change the world. The world is going to be such a better place because of what we're doing. That everybody, I mean, that's like a table stakes for meeting with a venture capitalist, right? But the reality is, it just makes us more efficient at whatever we already are. So if there is racism within humanity, it makes racism more efficient at propagating that, getting worse, right? If there is injustice, right? And if there's good things, right? It makes the good things more efficient. And but if we treat ourselves like a god, like we dismiss all of the evil that we do with this technology, because oh wow, because look at how amazing we are, and so one sort of layer of meaning with that, if you look at it as a story about technology, is that God is stopping them from treating themselves like God, from having that self perception, and when that happens, then you have to deal with the brokenness and the evil that exists. So, yeah, I don't know.
Well, actually, when you were saying that, it just made me think if the original intention in that
Mhm.
story was that there was supposed to be one language, right?
Mhm.
It sounds like the only reason why there's scattered languages was as a punishment.
Uh-huh.
So had they never done that, it sounds like one language was this is how I took
Right.
intention. There is this ideology about this one language, one nation, which I don't know if you've heard, but like
Mhm.
the U.S., for example, is so tied
Oh, right, yeah.
just English, right?
Hmm.
I'm just very curious, since we do see an influence of like Christianity in politics, if this ideology of like, okay, we just want one language here, we just want one type of nation here, and we
Yeah.
don't want all of this mixture because that wasn't the original intention.
Oh, wow,
That's
fascinating.
I just thought about that. Like, I wonder if that's where this ideology, because I read a lot of stuff in like research about this ideology of one language, one nation,
Mhm.
and how there's such an anti-bilingual bias here. Like,
Yeah.
really, like encouraged to learn more languages here. It's kind of like English only.
Yeah.
However, like the rest of the world's very bilingual and
Right.
multilingual.
There's that.
The US is very particular in that way.
There's that classic joke of like, what do you call somebody who has two languages? Bilingual, three languages, trilingual. What is somebody who only speaks one language? American.
Literally, because the rest of the world, we're in such a bubble, but the rest of the world is not like
Yeah.
it's very multilingual. So I just thought about that. Like, I wonder if the Tower of Babel has perpetuated some sort of ideology of like we really should. The original intention was to be just one language.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, Gabby, thank you for opening up all of your giant brain around language for us. I appreciate that. This is if you are listening to this in the podcast form, we really appreciate that. And any person that you think is like a nerd about this or interested in Tower of Babel, you should share that with them. And if you can give us a review or all the stars, that's great. We also are part of this bigger community of people that are having really deep conversations like this online about God. It's called Not Church, and you can be part of that by going to patreon.com/skepticpastor. All right, so we're gonna do you have a little time for Q&A? Okay, we're gonna do some Q&A. So if you have questions, go ahead and put that in the chat. We're on Instagram and TikTok and YouTube. I'm pulling up the YouTube stream right now. But go ahead and put that in the chat. If you're on TikTok, the lovely DJ is going to help find your questions and raise those up for us. If you're on YouTube or Instagram, just go ahead and put those. I'll try to keep an eye on those questions. And we'll just answer as many of those as we can before we have to go on to the next thing. All right, let's check out all of these platforms. If you're just joining, we're doing some Q&A. You can post those questions in the chat. And and we will answer as many of those as we can. There is like a delay from me saying this to people actually hearing it, so it's always one of those moments of like, oh, we need to just wait. And I see Alex C is saying hello. Hey, Alex C, it's good to see you. Um, uh, Thanks for reaching out. We were just answering this question about the Tower of Babel and language acquisition, and sort of the evolution of language. Gabby is a linguist. She's getting her PhD in linguistics. So you're welcome to ask questions about that or about other things. So you just post those questions in the chat. Um, uh, I like to hear where Gabby is status wise in her academic pursuits.
Great question. Yeah, I am currently doing my PhD right now. I'm in the later half of it, so in the dissertation phase. It's a bunch of research going on right now, and so I am basically trying to. I am doing the process of dissertation right now, so I should be done soon with the
Right.
next year and a half.
That's
So.
great. And what is your dissertation on?
My dissertation is on. Oh, great question. I am basically looking at a specific phonetic feature that is found in the Dominican Republic.
Mm-hmm.
And it's only really found in this region, and it's very stigmatized. And so I'm kind of looking at what people's attitudes are towards it.
Oh, interesting.
Not anybody's attitudes, Dominicans' attitudes towards this Dominican feature, and then I'm looking to see if skin color changes people's perception
Uh-huh.
of this phonetic variant.
Oh, that's
So
interesting.
a bit about race, because I hypothesize that people's issues aren't only with the way that you say something, but it's the way that you look as well. So what happens if I present a darker face than like a lighter face?
Oh, interesting. That's really fascinating. All right, we've got another one. How do you think language might evolve if consciousness evolves beyond words? Wow, that's a deep question.
Wow. So in my deconstruction,
You're right.
I have been actually trying to learn a bit more about philosophy. So I know there's this problem of consciousness that's really talked about.
Right.
I don't know too much about it.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I can really, I'm not sure, because I feel like I don't know enough to answer this.
Okay, let me give you. There's a lot of ways that people think about consciousness, but in the spirituality realm, the idea of consciousness is this: is the is the you that's you that is not body, and so like if I cut off your arm, you're still Gabby, right? And if you lost the ability to speak, you would also still be Gabby. And then there is the sense that when somebody dies, their essence continues on in some sort of other existence. And so consciousness is that, but the idea is that consciousness is growing and people are becoming even bigger in humans are becoming even bigger in that part, and people will talk about meditative practices that allow people to be conscious of things in other places or reach these higher levels of sort of mystical understanding or experience. And so I think this question is based on that idea that like, what if the consciousness of humans becomes outside of needing words?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I should say this sounds like the Christian equivalent to a soul.
Right. Yeah.
This is what you just described. Yeah, I mean, I think language isn't limited only to words, and I something I meant to say during our talk before. You have nonverbal languages like sign language, for example.
Yes. Right.
And so there's many different ways to communicate. You have even dialects in Africa that use clicks as sounds, and those clicks are how they communicate. So I don't know if you don't use words, you could use sounds. You could use bodily expressions. I don't know if consciousness would maybe. I don't know if this is something that's like not necessarily fantasy, but like could we just in our consciousness communicate with one another by looking at each other.
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
not sure.
Yeah. I think one of the things that people sometimes point to is when people are really close, they can understand each other without using words. Yeah. I don't know.
And if anyone's interested in that, there is a book called Talking Voices by Deborah Tanning that kind of talks about.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, we have another question. What is your understanding of what the Bible means by the kingdom of God is within you? This is really cool. I'll answer this one. um, so there is this sort of mystical understanding of that is echoed in this verse. A lot of Christian mystics hang a lot of things on this verse. The idea is that um, within us uh, is infinity, right? The part of the image of God that's talked about in the book of Genesis, it is well, you can point to like the idea of the survivability of the soul, right? That is the image of God, and that we have sort of a much fuller access to God um, uh, deep within us than we do sort of on the surface, and mystics will, if you put it in psychological languages, would sort of imply that the logical, more conscious mind um, limits is a limiting factor to this deeper reality, and it filters it into a world that needs language and that kind of stuff. But if a lot of meditative practices are actually about finding a way to unlock the subconscious, and some of them sort of occupy the conscious mind with a mantra. Some of them are teaching people how to let go of thoughts in general, so that they're just sort of in this deeper space. And I think that is that deeper idea that we would talk about, I think, in more scientific language as the subconscious and the conscious, that is the reality that's being pointed to by that verse in the Bible. The kingdom of God is within you. So, yeah, there's an answer. Um, so here's a next, um, the next question is deconstruction another word for apostasy? I'm going to make Chat GPT uh, 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 tell me a brief definition for apostasy so we don't have to get into a whole thing. But apostasy is the act of abandoning or renouncing one's religious faith, beliefs, or allegiance, especially after previously professing them. And apostasy is at the extreme level of like, I am no longer believing any of this. I am going to believe something completely different, not just a single belief, but all of them. So, you were just talking about having experienced deconstruction. Is deconstruction just another name for theological apostasy?
I want to say that I don't think it's so black and white.
Right.
I think it's actually very gray, and I feel like I can't even speak for deconstruction because everyone's deconstruction process looks so different.
Yeah.
Some people land, they go through these years and years and land right back where they started.
Right.
Some people end up going pretty far away and end up in the agnostic realm.
Uh-huh.
Some people end up going to different religions and end up becoming very spiritual. So
right.
It to say that I don't believe anything,
yeah,
I don't think would be quite accurate.
Yeah.
I think a lot of my ethical or moral choices or like kind of models that I saw growing up, which these are still things that I cling on to about, really loving the oppressed and loving the outcast and caring for the homeless. So I think those are things that I still believe.
Yeah.
Maybe so much of the truth claims of the mystical things, I'm quite not sure.
Yeah,
So,
for sure.
I wouldn't say I'm completely no because I'm in the agnostic realm. I don't know if I would myself equated to apostasy myself.
Yeah.
It's kind of great.
Yeah, and I work with lots of people who are in some. I just don't like deconstruction. The word, I don't like the image that it brings up in people's minds. But I work with a lot of people who are would be labeled as being in a state of deconstruction, and I my experience of that is. Uh, you said, is it theological apostasy? My experience with those people and my own experience is, I would say it is more theological exploration, right? A lot of people are coming from a place of very defined, very hardened theological beliefs that if you don't believe this thing, then you are not a Christian. And that binary is frustrating. And so some of them, because that binary was programmed so deep within them, might say, well, I can't believe in the literal reading of the book of Genesis, therefore I'm not a Christian. But the reality of what is going on is they are exploring theology, beliefs about God for the first time, um, you know, in the wide open, not just in this one little tiny niche group, and so and for some people it looks like experimentation, right? For some people it looks like research, and in some people it looks like trying to understand what the embodiment of these beliefs, like what do they imply as to how I live? Does this match, right?
Yeah, that's actually such a great way to put it. I think it's exactly what you said, theological exploration. I think what deconstruction has done for me was, instead of, and that for a lot of people, instead of just being forced beliefs,
right,
you can actually be like the rest of the world who gets to discover it on their own, discover the fact that there's other religions, other beliefs, and other ways to live.
right.
That's, I think, the shock that people get, because
Yeah.
like, wow, I need to think about this as if I was back years ago.
For sure. Yeah, and I think we're answering your questions. If you've got a question, you can go ahead and you can put it in the chat on Facebook or Instagram or YouTube. We're going to answer as many as we can. I think when you talk about like theological exploration, I find that that's best done in community with other people, but accepting community with people that are helping you do that. And we're part of something called Not Church, which is like church. It's a spiritual community, people that are exploring spiritual things, but also community in the sense that people like what people want from church, like support, conversation, deep relationships where people are there for you in hard times, and that's, I love it. And if people are interested in that, they can go to patreon.com/skepticpastor. We charge for it because also a lot of the people in there have experienced religious trauma around being manipulated out of money. But if you are a person that doesn't have, it's like $3 a month. If you can't swing that, just let us know, and we'll have a way to get you in for free. Okay. Another question. Do you think we lose anything when we translate experience into words? Okay, so you're the linguist. Do we lose anything?
This is such a great question. Who asked this? Whoever asked this is a great question. That depends on your perspective of language. In a sense, language. Ooh, hold on. Language can be limiting in the sense of that there's so many words you can use to describe an experience.
Right.
And so you are in the confines, technically, of language when you put down to paper or to words something you went through.
Right.
If it's something so awe-filling that it's like hard to describe,
the
only thing you can really use is what you know.
Yeah.
So, and I think I mentioned this book last week, but it's kind of the same concept that A.W. Tozer talks about in his The Knowledge of the Holy, about God being so infinite and so magnificent, and us being limited by even our words to describe the being that he is.
Yeah.
I think that can be described with experiences as well.
Yeah.
You know? However, language, I just taught today in my class about recursivity, which has to do with the fact that something that's different from human languages than animal languages is the possible combinations that we can do with syntax. Like we're able to create infinite amount of sentences and possibilities. Like because we are creative and because the syntax allows for like, my dog who went to the store with my neighbor who's also my friend who, and you can just keep adding. And so, there is like I should say maybe like a infinite amount of possibilities for sentence combinations.
Yeah.
However, it is still limited because we are bounded to language, if that makes sense. So I want to say, are you asking me or like a general? Do I think it's something that is we limit experience? Potentially.
Right.
Use other ways to describe things that are not just words.
Yeah. All right. Yes. Yeah. Right. Like, I mean, like I've had the frustration of like trying to communicate something that was really profound to me, but not having the right words or syntax, right? Because it's beyond, it was beyond my ability to use the language. Okay, we have another question. So do you think that when the Bible quotes God saying, "Let us make man in our image," do we have the Trinity? No. That is not an appropriate biblical biblical scholars will not say that. Trinity is something that evolved over hundreds of years after the New Testament was done being created. That's not what that is. There's something called in the language, something called the majestic plural. And so that is used in when you have when you have God speaking, right? It's an honorific. It's kind of like the royal we, right?
That's interesting. I was going to say, and I don't know if this is, I think when I was reading Dan McCullen's book and he talked about this specifically, he had mentioned the hour referring to like the council of gods that was in referencing the Old Testament.
Right.
And so it's not, from what I've seen in my research of deconstruction, the Trinity was a concept that came way later.
Right.
To kind of reconcile for some, the relationship that Jesus had with God, because it sounded like they were like, fine both, but so that's
and there's different places where it's where you have that in a couple of different ways. In that point, at least my understanding is it's that majestic plural and not actually implying all of them. But I'm sure, like, I'm not a biblical scholar. Do not ever think that I am. I read biblical scholars. I have a graduate level of education in that. But what I ended up after basically it's a 90 hours, so like a double hour master degree. I was very confident that I could read and understand scholars, but that I was not one. So I would say also look at Dan McClellan or Pete Enns, because there is this idea of the divine council that is just assumed in the Old Testament, where there are multiple gods, and that there might be one God that rules over them, or the most powerful one. But yeah, it's assumed that there are multiple gods. Okay.
Other thing, this is also why it's so important, like for like linguists to understand like the language that something is written in and what the text actually says, because something as small as a pronoun, like our, changes the meaning. In the same way, I was shocked when I was reading Dan McCullen's book, and I believe it's later in his book, and the Bible says so. He talks about, we are taught, our translation, at least the NIV that I read, said the first words in the Bible, in the beginning. Right. The definite article, something that is referred to, something that's definite.
And that's a poor translation.
Right. And the actual translation, what Dan McCullen was saying, is it's in a beginning.
Right.
In a beginning. And
right.
in the beginning are not the same.
Right.
Thing,
Yeah. Or another one is like, as things were beginning, or God began create, like it's very much, there's something there. There's not creation ex nihilo, which is what is implied by that like inaccurate translation.
Right. There is like, in the beginning, this is the definite thing that happened, but in a beginning can apply a story that I'm providing to my audience. Right.
Yeah.
That's such a different, and one little article changes the meaning. So
yeah,
that's cool. You should definitely look into like hermeneutics and
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the live stream. We have done an hour and 10 minutes, so we're gonna get off. We do these usually at least once a week, and the podcast is the Unbelief Podcast. There's going to be an episode that comes out tomorrow that is actually about what community is and digital community and how that works. And then this episode that talks about the Tower of Babel and linguistics will be out on Sunday. So, yeah, thanks so much for showing up and asking all the great questions. Oh. I'm having to streaming